My name is Grace Holloway. I was 15 years old and 7 weeks pregnant the night my father set my suitcase on the front porch of our house in Asheboro, North Carolina, and told me not to come back. 20 years later, that same father called me, his voice shaking, asking if there was any way I could help save the house I grew up in from foreclosure. Before I explain what I actually did in response to that call, let me take you back to the night everything changed, because a single request for help, made 20 years later, doesn't reveal itself in isolation. It's the final chapter of a story that started with a suitcase on a porch and a lie told to an entire church congregation. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every one. I grew up in a modest 3-bedroom house on the edge of Asheboro, the only daughter of Harold and Bethany Holloway, with one younger brother, Caleb, 3 years behind me. My father worked as a foreman at a furniture manufacturing plant that had, for most of my childhood, provided a stable if unremarkable income. My mother managed our household and was deeply involved in our local Baptist congregation, a community that occupied an outsized place in how our family understood its own reputation and standing. Caleb, from an early age, had been positioned within our family as the child whose future mattered most. He was academically gifted in ways I wasn't, and my parents had begun, even before either of us reached our teenage years, quietly setting aside money specifically earmarked for his eventual college education, an ambition they discussed openly and proudly at every family gathering and church function. I discovered I was pregnant at 15, the result of a relationship with a boy 2 years older who disappeared from my life almost entirely once I told him, leaving me to face my parents alone with news I understood, even then, would detonate something in our household that couldn't easily be repaired. I told my mother first, on a Tuesday evening, in the kitchen, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out clearly. Her face went through a transformation I still remember with painful clarity, shock, then something that looked almost like grief, and finally, a cold, controlled fury that frightened me more than any reaction I'd anticipated. "Your father cannot know this happened in this house," she said, her voice low and tight. "Do you understand what this would do to us at church? To Caleb's reputation, applying to colleges next year?" I didn't fully understand, at 15, exactly what my mother meant by that specific framing, as though my pregnancy represented a threat to Caleb's future rather than a crisis in my own life that deserved its own consideration entirely. My father found out 3 days later, my mother apparently deciding that concealment wasn't sustainable, and his reaction confirmed every fear my mother's initial response had planted in me. He didn't yell, not initially. He simply sat in his recliner, staring at the television without actually watching it, for nearly 20 minutes before finally speaking. "You've ruined this family's name," he said. "Everything your mother and I have built in this community, everything we're trying to give your brother, and you've thrown it away for some boy who's already gone. Dad, I need help. I don't know what to do. What you need to do is think about what this looks like for this family. For Caleb. He's got college applications coming up in 2 years, and I won't have this town whispering about his sister, the unwed teenage mother, while he's trying to build a future." I sat with that response for a long moment, feeling something break inside me that I don't think ever fully repaired, not even decades later. So what happens to me? My father didn't answer that question directly, not that night. It took another week of tense, mostly silent cohabitation before he made his decision clear, packing a single suitcase with what he considered my essential belongings and setting it on the front porch on a Sunday evening, just hours after church, where my mother had apparently already told the congregation, without any advance warning to me, that I'd be going to stay with relatives in Tennessee for an extended period. "You'll figure something out," my father said, standing in the doorway, refusing to meet my eyes directly. "But you're not staying in this house, not like this. Your mother and I have Caleb's future to protect, and we can't have this hanging over this family." I stood on that porch at 15 years old, 7 weeks pregnant, a single suitcase beside me, watching my father close the front door without another word, understanding, with a clarity that still felt shocking even as it happened, that my own parents had decided my life mattered less than the story they wanted to preserve for my younger brother's benefit. I spent that first night sleeping in the bus station in downtown Ashborough, too frightened and disoriented to think clearly about any actual plan, holding on to the small amount of babysitting money I'd saved over the previous year, which amounted to barely $340. By morning, a woman named Constance Ridley, who worked the overnight shift at the station's small diner counter, noticed me still sitting in the same corner booth I'd occupied for nearly 10 hours and asked, gently, whether I had somewhere to go. I didn't. Constance, who I'd later learn had raised 3 children largely on her own after her husband left, made a decision that would end up defining the entire trajectory of my life going forward. She offered me a spare room in her small house, on the condition that I attend school regularly and contribute what I could toward household expenses once I was able. I lived with Constance for the following 3 years, through the remainder of my pregnancy and the early years of raising my son, Elliot, while finishing high school through an alternative program designed for teen parents. Constance never asked for anything beyond basic respect and honesty, treating me with a consistency and warmth I hadn't experienced from my own parents in longer than I could remember. My mother called exactly twice during those first 3 years, both times briefly, both times carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of what had actually happened, instead framing our estrangement in vague, deflecting terms that made clear she still expected me to eventually understand and forgive the decision without any genuine accounting of its actual impact. "We're just trying to protect this family," she said, during the second of those calls, when Elliot was already nearly 2 years old. "You'll understand someday, when you're older." I didn't respond to that call with anger, exactly. I responded with a kind of exhausted clarity that surprised even me. "Mom, I understand completely right now. You decided Caleb's college applications mattered more than your 15-year-old daughter having somewhere safe to sleep. I don't need to get older to understand that. I understood it perfectly the night Dad put my suitcase on the porch." She didn't call again for nearly 6 years after that conversation. I completed my GED at 18, working 2 jobs simultaneously to support Elliot while slowly building towards something more stable. Constance, who by then had become something considerably closer to a genuine mother figure than either of my biological parents had managed to be, encouraged me to pursue further education, eventually helping me apply for financial aid that allowed me to attend a community college program in accounting. By 25, I'd completed my associate's degree and secured a position at a regional accounting firm in Greensboro, work that gradually, over the following years, developed into a genuinely stable, well-compensated career. I married my husband, Desmond, when Elliot was 7, a man who'd never once treated my son as anything other than fully his own, and together we built a life that felt, for the first time since that night on the porch, genuinely secure. I learned, through occasional updates from a cousin who remained in contact with my mother, that my parents had told our church congregation and extended family a carefully constructed story about my absence, that I'd gone to stay with relatives in Tennessee to help care for an ailing aunt, a fabrication that conveniently explained my sudden disappearance without requiring any acknowledgement of the actual pregnancy or the decision to force me out of my own home. Caleb, meanwhile, had gone on to attend the state university my parents had spent years saving toward, graduating with an engineering degree and eventually building his own stable career and family in Charlotte. I'd had minimal contact with him over those years, our relationship reduced to occasional, awkward exchanges at the rare family funeral or wedding neither of us could avoid attending. By my mid-30s, I'd built a life entirely separate from my parents' ongoing presence in it, a stable marriage, a teenage son who'd grown into a thoughtful, accomplished young man himself, a career that had advanced steadily into a senior accounting position overseeing a regional client portfolio. I rarely thought about that night on the porch anymore, not because the memory had faded, but because I'd deliberately built a life substantial enough that the wound no longer defined my daily existence the way it once had. The phone call that would eventually bring my parents back into direct contact with me came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, 20 years almost exactly from the night I'd been forced onto that porch, my father's voice on the other end carrying a shakiness I'd never heard from him before, not even during the worst of our confrontation 2 decades earlier. "Grace," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I understand if you say no. The house, the one you grew up in, we're facing foreclosure. Your mother and we've fallen behind on the mortgage since I lost my job at the plant last year, and we don't have anywhere else to turn." I sat with that request for a long moment, my phone against my ear, the ordinary Tuesday evening suddenly feeling considerably less ordinary. 20 years of carefully built distance, and my father's first substantial conversation with me in nearly 2 decades was a request for financial rescue. "Dad, I need you to explain something to me first, before we talk about the house. What happened to Caleb's college fund? The money you and Mom spent years telling everyone at church you were saving specifically for his education." There was a pause, long enough that I understood, even before he answered, exactly how uncomfortable this particular question made him. That money went toward his tuition, mostly. Some of it toward his wedding, years later. We don't have anything left from that fund at this point. So the money you prioritized over keeping your pregnant 15-year-old daughter in her own home is entirely gone now, and you're calling me, the daughter you put on the porch with a suitcase, to help save the house. Grace, I know how this looks. I know we made a terrible decision that night, one I've regretted more than you probably realize. But we're genuinely desperate right now. The bank is threatening to foreclose within 60 days if we can't bring the mortgage current. I felt something complicated settle in my chest, hearing that admission of regret for the first time in 20 years, though its timing, arriving only once my parents needed something concrete from me, colored how genuinely I could receive it. "Dad, does Caleb know you're calling me about this?" "He does. He offered what he could, but his own finances are stretched with his kids' private school tuition and their mortgage. He suggested we reach out to you, actually. He said you'd built a stable career, that you might be in a position to help." I absorbed that detail slowly, understanding, with a clarity that felt considerably colder than anger, that even now, 20 years later, my family's calculation about my value remained fundamentally unchanged. I existed, in their ongoing understanding of our family, primarily as a resource to be called upon when convenient, rather than a daughter whose actual well-being had ever genuinely mattered as much as Caleb's. "I need some time to think about this, Dad. I'll call you back." I didn't call Constance immediately, though she remained, even 20 years later, the person whose judgment I trusted most completely on matters like this. Instead, I sat with Desmond that evening, laying out the entire situation, the full history he already knew in general terms but hadn't heard me articulate with quite this specific clarity before. "What do you want to do?" he asked, once I'd finished. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to refuse entirely, to let them experience even a fraction of the abandonment they inflicted on me at 15. But part of me recognizes that refusing wouldn't actually address anything meaningful about the pattern itself. It would just be a mirror image of their own cruelty, rather than something that actually resolves the deeper injustice. What would resolving it actually look like, to you? I considered that question for several days before arriving at an answer that felt, to me, considerably more meaningful than either simple refusal or straightforward financial rescue. I called my father back a week later, having spent that time consulting with a financial advisor and, separately, with an attorney familiar with family trust and property matters, developing a plan that would address the practical crisis my parents faced while also, finally, forcing an honest reckoning with what had actually happened 20 years earlier. "Dad, I'm willing to help save the house," I told him, "but I need something in return, something that has nothing to do with money." "What do you need?" "I need you and Mom to tell the truth. To the church congregation, to our extended family, to Caleb's children, to everyone who's spent the last 20 years believing I went to stay with relatives in Tennessee. I need the actual story told, clearly, without euphemism, that you put your pregnant 15-year-old daughter out of the house because you prioritized your son's reputation and college fund over her safety." The silence on the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "Grace, that's going to be humiliating, for your mother especially, within the church community she's still deeply involved in." "Dad, I slept in a bus station at 15 years old, 7 weeks pregnant, because you and Mom decided my humiliation and abandonment were acceptable costs for protecting Caleb's future. I think a conversation with your church community is a considerably smaller price than what you asked me to pay that night. My father called me back 3 days later, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested the intervening conversation with my mother had been considerably more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Your mother is willing to do this, he said. It's taken her some time to agree, but she understands now that this is what you need in order to help us. Dad, I need you to understand something clearly. This isn't a negotiating tactic to extract an apology before I write a check. I need this because I've spent 20 years watching my own family maintain a fiction that protected your reputation at the expense of the actual truth about what happened to me. If I'm going to help save the house you raised me in, the house I was forced out of, I need the record corrected, publicly, before any financial assistance happens. We arranged, over the following weeks, a plan that satisfied both requirements. I worked with my financial advisor to structure a solution that would bring the mortgage current and establish a sustainable payment plan going forward, using funds from an investment account I'd built over the preceding decade, structured as a formal loan with clear repayment terms rather than a gift, given everything that had happened between us. Separately, my parents arranged a meeting with their church's pastor and several close family friends, where they told, for the first time in 20 years, an accurate account of what had actually happened the night I left home. Not the story about staying with relatives in Tennessee, but the truth about a 15-year-old pregnancy, a father who'd set a suitcase on the porch, and a mother who'd fabricated a cover story rather than face the community's judgment honestly. I wasn't present for that specific conversation, having decided, after considerable thought, that my presence would make the moment more about spectacle than genuine accountability. But Constance, who I'd remained close with over the following 2 decades and who still lived in the same community, attended on my behalf, later describing to me the visible shock and discomfort that rippled through the small gathering as my parents finally corrected 2 decades of carefully maintained fiction. Your mother cried through most of it, Constance told me. I don't know if those were tears of genuine remorse or simply humiliation at finally being exposed, but either way, the truth is out there now, clearly, for anyone who'd been wondering about your absence all these years. Caleb called me shortly after that meeting, his voice carrying a discomfort I hadn't expected from him specifically, given how little direct involvement he'd had in the original decision 20 years earlier. Grace, I had no idea the full extent of what happened that night. I mean, I knew you left, obviously, but I always understood it as you choosing to go stay with relatives, exactly the story Mom and Dad told everyone. I didn't know they'd actually forced you out, or that they'd specifically framed it as protecting my college fund. You were 12, Caleb. I don't blame you for believing what Mom and Dad told you at the time. But I do think it's worth understanding, now, exactly what was sacrificed to protect your future, so you can decide for yourself what kind of relationship you want with that history going forward. I want you to know, I never asked for any of that. I didn't know my education was apparently more important to them than keeping you safe. I believe that, Caleb. This was never really about your choices. It was about a decision our parents made, one that positioned you as more valuable without ever consulting you about whether you wanted that valuation applied at your sister's expense. The mortgage assistance I'd arranged brought my parents' house current within 30 days, the formal loan structure ensuring a clear, documented repayment plan rather than another instance of unstructured family financial entanglement. My father, notably, insisted on adhering strictly to that repayment schedule, making his first payment within the agreed timeframe, a level of accountability that felt, to me, considerably more meaningful than any verbal apology could have provided on its own. 18 months have passed since that phone call where my father, his voice shaking, asked whether I could help save the house I'd been forced out of 20 years earlier. My parents have continued making consistent, on-time payments toward the loan I structured, a pattern of financial accountability that stands in stark contrast to the emotional accounting they'd avoided for the 2 decades preceding that reckoning. My relationship with my parents remains considerably more distant than what most people might consider a fully repaired family bond, though it exists now on terms I never had access to before, built on documented truth rather than a carefully maintained fiction designed to protect their reputation at my expense. My mother has attempted, several times over these past 18 months, to move our relationship towards something warmer, something closer to the family connection she seems to genuinely want now that the truth has been publicly acknowledged. I think about that night constantly, she told me, during one of our infrequent, still careful phone calls. I've had 20 years to sit with what we did, and I don't think I ever fully let myself feel the weight of it until we had to actually say it out loud to people who'd trusted our version of events for 2 decades. I appreciate you finally saying that directly, Mom. But I need you to understand, I'm not looking for a fully restored relationship simply because the truth is now public. I'm willing to maintain the connection we currently have, occasional, honest, without pretense, but I'm not interested in pretending the last 20 years can simply be erased by a single difficult conversation with your church community. I understand that, she said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed she genuinely did. Elliot, now 20, has developed his own careful, limited relationship with his grandparents, one built entirely on his own terms rather than any expectation I've placed on him. He knows the full history, understands exactly what happened the night I was forced out of that house while pregnant with him, and has chosen, deliberately, to maintain polite but boundaried contact rather than either full estrangement or uncomplicated reconciliation. I think it's important that they know I exist, and that I know them, he told me once, but I don't think that requires pretending what happened to you doesn't matter, or that it's ancient history now that everyone knows the truth. Constance passed away last spring, and at her funeral, surrounded by the community that had actually shown up for me when my own parents chose reputation over their daughter's safety, I found myself reflecting on the specific irony of how completely a stranger's kindness had shaped the entire trajectory of my adult life, in ways my own family's eventual, delayed accountability could never fully replicate or repair. My parents attended that funeral, standing respectfully at the back of the small chapel, understanding, I think, exactly what Constance had represented in the story of my survival, a stark, permanent reminder of exactly who had actually shown up when I needed help most, 20 years before they finally found themselves needing something from me in return. I think, often, about the specific calculation embedded in that Tuesday evening phone call, 20 years of silence, broken only by a request for financial rescue, arriving precisely when my parents' own circumstances had finally shifted enough to require something only I could provide. I think about how easily I could have simply refused, mirroring the exact abandonment I'd experienced at 15, and how differently satisfying that refusal might have felt in the moment, compared to the considerably harder work of demanding actual truth before extending any assistance. What actually happened instead, the structured loan, the public correction of 20 years of fiction, the careful, boundaried relationship that's developed since, required a kind of patience and clarity I couldn't have accessed during those earliest years of my own survival, when Constance's kindness was the only thing standing between me and genuine desperation. But it produced something I've come to value considerably more than either simple revenge or uncomplicated forgiveness, a family relationship finally built on an accurate accounting of what actually happened, rather than a comfortable story that had protected everyone except the daughter who'd paid the actual cost of maintaining it. I transitioned out of the Army 8 months later, an honorable discharge I'd requested rather than one that was pushed on me, and I want to be clear about why, because it wasn't the money that made the decision for me. It was Junie starting to pull herself up on the coffee table, wobbling on legs that hadn't existed the last time I'd deployed for a 2-week field exercise, and realizing I'd missed the first attempt entirely because I'd been in a motor pool 3 states away. 5 years of service had given me something I needed, a spine, a set of skills, the specific confidence that comes from proving to yourself you can survive on nothing but discipline and a paycheck too small for the work it covered. I didn't need the Army to keep proving that to me anymore. I needed to be present for the parts of my daughter's life that don't repeat themselves. Constance didn't try to talk me into staying in uniform, and she didn't try to talk me into anything else either, not business school, not a board seat, not the life she'd once imagined for me before I'd chosen a different one at 22. What she offered instead, quietly, over a dinner at her house 6 weeks after my discharge came through, was something I hadn't expected from her at all. I want to fund something, she said. Not for you. For families like the one you were, standing in that commissary line 3 weeks before I found out what my son had done. She slid a folder across the table, not a legal document this time, just a plain manila folder with a handwritten title on the tab. Junie's Fund. Emergency grants, she said. Formula, diapers, rent, bridges, whatever a young military family needs in the specific month things fall apart. No means testing bureaucracy, no 6-week wait for approval. If a caseworker on a base says a family needs $400 this week to keep the lights on, they get it by Friday. I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Part of me, the part that still, honestly, carried some suspicion toward anything with the Reyes name attached to it, wondered whether this was penance dressed up as generosity, a way for Constance to feel better about 6 weeks of failing to notice her own son's theft. But watching her face while she said it, I didn't think that was quite right. I think she genuinely couldn't undo what had happened to me. And this was the closest thing she had to a way of making sure it happened to fewer people going forward. I want to run it, I told her. Not just fund it. Run it. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her since the diner. I was hoping you'd say that. We built it together over the following year, a small foundation, deliberately unglamorous, staffed mostly by military spouses who understood exactly what a Tuesday looks like when the formula budget and the electric bill are competing for the same $30. We kept the application to 1 page. We processed emergency requests within 72 hours. In the first year alone, we got formula, rent assistance, our utility bridges to over 1,100 families across 6 installations, and every single number in that count represented somebody standing in a checkout line doing the same grinding math I used to do, at 2 in the morning, with a baby finally asleep against my chest. My relationship with my parents settled into something smaller than what I'd had before I enlisted, but also, strangely, more honest than anything we'd managed in the 22 years before that. My father calls on Junie's birthday and doesn't push for more than that. My mother sends cards, still, occasionally, with handwriting that's steadier than it was in that conference room but never quite as confident as it used to be. I don't know if either of them has fully reckoned with what they did, or whether $5 million in restitution and a quiet family disgrace was ever going to be enough to make them. That's not really my work to finish. I did my part. I told the truth in a room full of lawyers, and I let the consequences land where they landed. Constance became something in my life I genuinely hadn't expected to get back. She comes to Junie's daycare graduation. She sends absurdly impractical gifts, the kind meant for a much older child, because she says she's making up for lost holidays and doesn't particularly care if the logic holds up. She still runs board meetings like a general and still terrifies half the attorneys who work for her, but she calls me every Sunday now, just to talk, and some Sundays we don't talk about the foundation or the trust or anything that happened in that conference room at all. Some Sundays we just talk about Junie learning to say new words, or a recipe she's trying, or nothing in particular, the way families are supposed to be able to do.